Well, everybody, welcome. I'm Tim Kane, JP Conte Fellow here at the Hoover Institution, part of Stanford University, and I think a couple people will filter in, but I was going to just remind, as I thought myself, to turn off my cell phone. Don't need to turn it off, just turn it to a tune that's more agreeable if we hear it buzz. So, really happy to have Marc Rosenblum with us today to talk about the Yearbook of Immigration Statistics for 2015. I'll do a more thorough introduction of Marc in just a second. I wanted to offer a few comments of my own about some of the things that we've been doing here at Hoover. As we focus on this report, it's largely a focus on legal immigration. There's so much immigration news happening right now that it's hard to keep it all organized. But one fact that I think shocked America and the world was when the Nobel Prize winners were announced this year, the United States had 6 winners. They were Sir J. Fraser Stoddart, Bengt Holmstrom, Oliver Hart, Duncan Haldane, David Thewlis, and Michael Kosterlitz. 6 of 6 were immigrants to the United States. So, and in fact, one study by Stuart Anderson of the National Foundation of American Policy found that American immigrants, legal immigrants, were winners of 40% of the Nobel Prizes given to the United States in our history. So legal immigration is widely seen by Americans as something that's very positive, part of our heritage, in contrast with frustration and controversy around illegal immigration. And there's nobody that's documented that more than the office that Marc represents and heads in the OIS, the Office of Immigration Statistics in the DHS. Here at the Hoover Institution for about, I think, 3 years now, I've personally been working on a project with Eddie Lazier on immigration reform. We've published about a quarterly online journal called Peregrine, where we survey experts. Our attitude has been that Eddie can put out a plan for immigration reform, or Gary Becker, who did put out a plan for, but what we want to do is to group as many expert minds as we could to see where we could find consensus among scholars left, right, and center, and non-ideological. When Marc was able to, he used to participate in that, so that was...
I can probably sign back up, I guess.
Could you? Maybe. And I've noticed Marc's still willing to come and speak with us today. The president of Mexico apparently won't come to America and talk about immigration, but Marc will come to Hoover and talk about it, so that's wonderful. Now, we also have a fact sheet on immigration, if you didn't see that. When we put together emphasizing there are so many myths about this issue, we wanted to put together a Hoover-based fact sheet just to dispel a lot of those myths, and it's why we wanted to have this event today to be titled Facts About Immigration Reform. So this won't be, I don't think, opinions so much as Marc and his team, I should say, have documented some of the really amazing trends in our history that goes back decades, if not centuries. Last thing I would mention to sort of promote Hoover's work is Bill Whalen and Tammy Frisbee just put out an issue of what the online journal Eureka. It's about California politics and economics. That was put out last week, and it included just an amazing survey of Californians and their attitudes on immigration, deportations, and the wall, and the surprising amount of support there is even among Californians to some of the elements that President Trump has just taken action on. Not all elements, but the things about building the wall and enforcing immigration law actually aren't that controversial even in a state of California where that's tend to be immigration heavy. So I would encourage you to look at that, the articles they have on sanctuary cities and other interesting issues. So let me turn to Marc Rosenblum. He's a Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of the Office of Immigration Statistics at DHS. He's in charge of the federal effort to account the comprehensive details on immigration to the United States, and his office is leading the DHS Transition Integration Initiative. He's got a strategic plan that I think may have been included in some of the handout that hopefully Marc will talk to us a little bit about today. The one that caught my eye was playing up a role as an internal DHS think tank. and we don't like competition, but it sounds like that might be good. Now, previously, he's got a pretty amazing track record, and fun to compare notes. Marc and I both were in the PhD program at UC San Diego. I was in economics. He was in UCSD's world-class political science PhD program about the same time. And coming from San Diego, that was a hot issue then in San Diego, immigration, and it is now, and I think it's probably shaped our research agendas ever since. So it's nice to celebrate the Tritons here a little bit.
Right on.
He also worked with Senator Edward Kennedy during the 2006 effort to put together comprehensive immigration reform. From 2011 to 13, Marc served as the National Research Council's Committee on Estimating Cost to the Department of Justice of Increased Border Security Enforcement by DHS. Now, he's also published more than 60 academic journal articles, book chapters, and policy briefs on immigration alone, immigration policy, and U.S.-Latin American relations. Also the co-editor with Daniel Titchener of the Oxford Handbook of International Migration. He earned his BA from Columbia University and his PhD from UCSD, and was for a while, before we brought him to DC, an associate professor of political science at the University of New Orleans. Now, I've asked Marc to talk to us for as long as you'd like, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, give some remarks, give us an overview. We'll have a discussion after that, and then have some Q&A with you all. And I've noticed that's where all the good questions come from. So,
great,
Marc.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you guys for coming. It's good to be here. I was going to give just a little bit of background on my office, what we do. I have one of my staffers, Chris Williams, is here, and I have an alum in the back of the room. The Office of Immigration Statistics has been around for at least 50 years. I think even a little bit longer than that. We were part of INS, and we were around before INS. The office, historically, what we have done is essentially to publish this yearbook. Historically, our role has been to collect immigration data from around DHS, and before that from around INS and whatever other federal immigration agencies we were part of, and to make that data available to Congress and the public. The office went through a rough stretch a few years ago. We went from 20 people down to 3 people, and we were essentially all but dormant for a period of time. We stopped publishing our yearbook. We stopped publishing other annual reports we put out, and I brought some other annual reports that are available in the back of the room. And then we just began a rebuilding effort about 2 years ago. We've hired back up to full strength. We created this new SES position that I came on to the to lead OIS a year ago tomorrow. We are hitting our stride in this rebuilding effort. As part of the rebuilding effort, in addition to publishing our traditional yearbook and publishing, we have 5 annual reports on immigration flows that we publish every year. One on lawful permanent resident flows, new green card holders, one on non-immigrant flows, one on immigration enforcement, one on refugees and asylees, and one on naturalizations. And then 3 population estimates that we publish every year on the unauthorized population, the non-immigrant population, and the lawful permanent resident population. So as part of this rebuilding effort, and this is described in the strategic plan I shared with you guys, one thing that we are committed to as part of this effort is to get back to doing timely publications and to make those publications a little bit more useful to you guys and to Congress. So in addition to just sort of putting out these tables, we expect to be, we have already begun and will continue to develop some sort of more sophisticated analytic tools to better, more comprehensively describe stuff that the department is doing and to be a think tank in the sense of the quality of reports that we're putting out to the public. A second thing is to give better policy analytics and data analytics to the Secretary and to DHS. DHS historically has not been a very sophisticated user of its own data. I know that in the past when the department has considered playing a role in policy debates, it has often turned to think tanks to help it do some of the modeling that we would like to be able to do internally. So that's a second priority under this strategic plan. A third priority is to do a much better job of getting our data out, better data dissemination. So one element of that is that we have recently revamped our website, which was badly in need of some revamping. So if you haven't gone to the OIS website lately, please go back. We've got a lot of, in addition to sort of all these yearbook tables, we have some supplemental tables that you won't find in the yearbook. And we have some additional sort of research products. But one of the things that we are standing up and just starting to do more of is to put out sort of a wider variety of products, some short form research papers and some infographics that we think will be useful. And then a fourth priority that we talk about is I'm very committed to supporting a lot of the hiring that we did to get back up to full strength happened before I got there, and I'm thrilled to say that those were great hires, and we've made a couple of more great hires since I've been there, and so we're doing a lot to continue to support our staff, and we would like to grow a little bit more. That's a little bit in flux right this minute to be able to meet some of the additional responsibilities that Congress has asked us to do, and then a fifth thing that our strategic plan talks about is that, as Tim mentioned, we've been tasked by our previous secretary with leading a DHS-wide immigration data integration initiative. And what that means is that currently DHS has about 60 separate immigration data systems around the department. And we are leading an effort to bring all of those different data systems into a common environment and connect records across those systems so that we can see people who appear in more than one system and see how they move among, find the common identifiers, and to be able to look in an integrated way at all of that data. And then build tools so that different users around the department can use that integrated data environment. So for operators, that will mean that a Border Patrol agent or an ICE officer or a USCIS benefits adjudicator will be able to type in a name and a number or put in some fingerprint data and learn everything that the department knows about that person, which right now involves phone calls to different people at different computer terminals. And at headquarters, it will mean that we can have visibility into the whole DHS data system and to be able to understand where the bottlenecks are, how people move throughout the enforcement system, how they move throughout the benefits system, and to use that for policy evaluation and policy analysis and budgeting and just to be smarter analysts of our own processes. We're also charged by Congress with being with ensuring the validity and reliability and accuracy of DHS immigration data and sort of being a clearinghouse for making sure that all the data that goes to Congress is accurate. So that is tied up in this same effort, this data integration initiative, where we've set up sort of working groups that span all of the operational components in the department to begin to get our arms around all that data. We're still sort of working with our leadership to figure out exactly, as we put in place sort of this better, more integrated, more reliable data system, how we divide up responsibility for pushing that information out. But we'll continue to play a big role in that, and we hope that you all will come to us with questions.
All right, so if I can ask you some questions, if you all, you all have this, but for anybody watching online, there's the yearbook this year. What are some of the trends, Marc, in 2015 that shifted from 2014, 2013? Or do you notice any in the last 5 years that you would want to highlight?
So we definitely see some pretty noteworthy trends when it comes to immigration enforcement, and some of these are clear in the yearbook. Some of them. So for all of these questions, you should, in addition to downloading the yearbook, you should also look at these flow reports that I mentioned that you can also find on our website, because the reports have a lot more sort of trend discussion and analysis. I mean, there's no discussion in the yearbook. The yearbook is just the tables.
Yeah.
And the reports have some analysis.
Yeah, I was looking for the pithy essay, and it's not here. It's all numbers.
It's over there.
Okay.
So one trend we see is in immigration enforcement data, and especially if you ask me the 5-year version of the question, what we've seen over the last 5 years is that there has been a sharp decrease in removals and returns from the interior. So we're deporting many fewer people apprehended inside the U.S. And continuing to deport large numbers of people from the border. But a second trend at the border is that the demographics of who is being apprehended at the border has also changed. So historically, almost everybody apprehended at the border were Mexican adults. Now, most people apprehended at the border are non-Mexican, and almost all of those non-Mexicans are Central Americans from the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That has been that trend gained a lot of attention in 2014. It started a little bit earlier than that. Going from 2014 to 2015, which this yearbook documents, we actually saw that. So in 2014, we saw this very dramatic surge of Central American women and children. In 2015, those numbers went way down again. And that was largely, I believe, a result of this concerted response that the U.S., working with Mexico and the countries in Central America, put in place to ramp up enforcement at the border, to begin doing expedited hearings, to detain most of these families, and then working in the region to do a public education campaign that people weren't going to be permitted to stay, and facilitating the repatriations. So 2015, you saw those numbers go way down, but a lot of that response was not able to be sustained, partly because the courts blocked part of it. Mexico didn't fully sustain what it was doing, and that public information campaign sort of broke down because it sort of conflicted with the facts on the ground. So we saw a huge spike in 2014, a big reversal in 2015, and we've seen another surge in 2016.
But so that's one of the questions I have. Interesting. We're talking about the newly released. How was this, weeks ago? The 2015 yearbook?
Yes.
So this is the 2015 yearbook, and we're having the event in January 2017. So we're missing a year here.
Yeah. So as I said, we were down to 3 people, and we were on life support. We just published our 2014 yearbook about 2 or 3 months ago. So that yearbook came out about 2.5 years late, almost 2.5 years late. This yearbook came out about a year and a half late. We will get 2016 out in late spring or early summer, which is really about where historically we always got our yearbooks out.
Yeah.
And then our 2017 yearbook we should get out in the early spring, and moving forward we expect to get them out within a few months at the end of the year.
So you put out the 2017 yearbook, not in 2017 though.
It'll come out early in FY18.
Okay.
Yeah, so the yearbook definitely doesn't come out, the fiscal year ends September 30th. We don't aspire to put the yearbook out in October because there's a lot of work that goes into vetting all of these different data sources that we get from the components and deduplicating, and this is the authoritative record of what the department has done, and at least with our current data systems, it takes us several months to get that done.
Working on reports, you're always worried about getting the numbers right. I can't imagine the pressure of it being a government report. You want to make sure you get every number right. But the Department of Labor, they put out a monthly employment report. They just modify last month's numbers.
Right.
So you guys could do that.
So this is an ongoing conversation that I agree with you.
Yeah.
I'll say for the record, I would like for us to put out monthly numbers, but it's hard. It would be. We're not staffed right now to do the vetting that we do monthly, and especially on the enforcement side, because all those enforcement processes evolve over time. There's no way they would be static numbers. We'd either have to update them the next month, or the months won't add up to the year.
Right.
So we're starting to think through what that should look like, and I think it should look like what you're describing, but that would be a huge shift from how the department has done business in the past.
So this documents there's some of the many tables. It documents year by year, and then decade by decade, country by country. And not only that, not only the country where the immigrants are coming from, but you have separate tables on recording the country of their birth. Now those sort of overlap pretty closely, but to me it's pretty amazing amount of detail. Do you see any shifts in that? And let me sort of preface this with another question. So I got the PDF version of this and did a search for the word illegal, and it's mentioned 0 times. And I did a search on undocumented, and it's mentioned 0 times. So this isn't about illegal immigration or undocumented immigration, though you have reports on that separately. So we're just focusing on what's in this yearbook about legal immigration. So there's a notion that the number of immigrants from Mexico is on the decline, and the number of immigrants from countries in Asia is on the rise, and that China had supplanted Mexico as the source, main source country, number one source country. That's not what that showed, though, in this yearbook for legal immigration. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So let me just, before I answer that question, I just want to respond a little bit to your preface to say that most of the tables in this yearbook, maybe all of the tables in this yearbook, come from forms that DHS operational personnel fill out when they're interacting with immigrants or with aliens. So we're able to count things like apprehensions and removals because every time somebody's apprehended, an agent fills out a form or online or on paper and says we've apprehended somebody. Agents don't count unauthorized immigrants. There's no form to fill out that says I found some.
Right.
You count apprehensions, you count removals, you count the number of visas that we've processed. So that's what is in this book. And something like estimating the unauthorized population, that involves sort of a statistical model and an analysis of several different data sources to try to figure that out mathematically. So those kind of data are not in here, but it's a record of all of the department's operations. To your question, there are certainly more. I think you're talking about lawful permanent residents,
Yes.
green card
so
holders.
let me flesh this out just a little bit. LPRs, lawful permanent residents. These are individuals who migrate to the United States and then can use that status to become citizens, right? So
after 5 years, generally they can apply to become citizens. There's a few more hurdles to get through at that point.
150 in 2015, 157,000 LPRs from Mexico. 146,000 from the Caribbean, which I thought was interesting. 47,000 from Central America. 71,000 from China. So that's half the number of the Mexican or the Caribbean. And these are similar to 2014, 2013, even a decade ago. Pretty similar numbers.
So the reason for that is that most of our lawful immigration, most green card flows, are based on family sponsorship. And there's a lot more Mexicans and Central Americans and Caribbeans, people of Caribbean descent in the U.S. than there are Chinese sponsoring their relatives back home.
Right.
So the trend that you expected to see, and there has been, there's been some news coverage. What has changed in recent years is Asia as a region now represents more new immigrants to the U.S. than North America as a region. So if you add up Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean, there's fewer immigrants from that part of the world than there are from China and India and the rest of Asia.
Philippines.
Right. So in 2015, 40% of all new green cards went to Asians, 35% went to North America, which is Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And so Asia is larger than North America. And the trend going back to 2000, since 2000, the share coming from Asia has increased 8%, and the share coming from North America has fallen 7%. So it's, for Asia to outnumber North America is new, and it's increasingly the case.
Yeah.
But it's not yet true that China outnumbers Mexico, and it's going to be a while before that's true.
So I'm going to opine here, my policy position, I've had it in a lot of my writings, I'm not going to ask you to opine, but that, legal immigration is where you find the most benefit. America's been the most generous country in terms of raw numbers of legal permanent residents or folks that are coming in as potential citizens. About 1 million a year, and that's been true, I think, through this millennium, right? So
Yes.
going back to 2000. If we build a wall or if we deport criminal illegal aliens, but that LPR number stays at 1 million a year, we're not going to lose much economic benefit. So I think the stance that President Trump has really focused on aren't really anti-immigrant. That's how I hear it. What I think is interesting, though, is those numbers aren't stable going back to the 1990s, 1980s, certainly the 1970s. And the contrast I think I found was there were about 400,000 LPRs on average in the 1970s. Now, some years it was 500 or more, some years it was more like 300, so a little bit more variation. It's been very steady for the last 15 years. Do you think it will, there are a couple questions in that. Why is that happening? And then two, who controls that lever? Is that something the president can just say, under the Trump administration, it's going to go back to 400,000, or is that Congress?
So Congress sets numerical limits on immigration. So the way the green card, the lawful permanent resident system works, there are 4 categories of green cards: family-based, employment-based, refugees, and diversity. The family, employment, and diversity are capped by Congress at, in legislation that was written in 1990. It was written in 1965 and updated in 1990.
Right.
And then certain family immigrants are exempted from those caps. Immediate relatives of U.S. citizens are exempted from the caps. So the spouses and younger than 21-year-old children of U.S. citizens don't count towards the caps, and so that allows for some variation. And then refugees are the number of refugees is set every year by the president in consultation with Congress.
And that number just caught my attention. I don't know if it was yesterday. President Trump made the announcement that he wants to shift that back to 60,000 a year, roughly cutting it in half.
Right.
It had I don't want to say snuck up, but it had been at about 90,000. I think President Obama, near the last 2 years of his term, raised it to about 120 or 119. So President Trump has put the refugee number back to somewhat of a historical norm.
So I think you were looking at the number of refugees who adjust, which is different than the number of refugees we admit. So the number that we admit has been capped at 70,000 for the last few years. I think at least the last 3 years, I think a little longer than that. And then this year, President Obama, I think for FY17, he raised it to 85 with a plan to raise it to 100 for 18.
Right.
So setting it back to 60 is a 60% reduction from that planned number. So the president has the authority to pretty much decide how many refugees we're going to admit.
Yeah.
And then to your earlier question, while Congress sets the upper limit on green card admissions,
Right.
And that, it would be difficult for President Trump to say, we're no longer going to admit that many people that are, there's a process that they're allowed to go through that's set out in statute. So it's hard for him to say from now on, you can't go through that. I mean, I think that would require congressional action. But what he can do is gum up the works for how quickly DHS is going to admit people. And what I think he has also announced is that all green card applicants will go through multiple in-person interviews not all green card applicants, all non-immigrant applicants will have to go through an in-person interview. So that would take up a lot of State Department resources that would slow down, could interfere with how many green cards we can issue, for example. So
that helps clarify. We're going to get to, I hope I have some questions just on refugees, just on non-immigrants. But on that number, it's more of a ceiling, and yet there's a bit of a waiting line too. So you may qualify to come in, say, as a sibling, and that's one of the priority categories. But there are 3.5 years roughly of siblings before you that will get into that block, assuming this cap is about the same of 1 million LPRs a year. Is that a fair characterization? Yes. So there's 2 different numerical limits that Congress sets. One is the overall number who can come, and then there's also a per country limit, and then there are also preference categories within the overall number. And the thing that really drives the waiting list is those per country limits, because basically every country is limited to 25,000 green cards a year, essentially, not counting the immediate family members. So Mexico burns through its 25,000 green cards a lot faster than Botswana does. And so people in Mexico who are waiting for a green card have to wait a lot longer because only 25, there's hundreds of thousands of people who could qualify for one of those family or employment-based slots, but they have to wait for their country turn. So before we look at specific categories and numbers, this issue of the office's strategic plan, I know that's something that's been important to you. Did you and your team wrote that? So that's coming from the new regime at OIS? So that's the new regime. About that. So that was in my first day or so on the job, I was told to do that. Yeah. And in consultation with my leadership within the Office of Policy and in the department. But I talked about. What went into that plan was a lot of what I talked about when I interviewed for the job. So my background, working
on the Hill and also working at think tanks and working in academia, I spent a lot of time trying to get good immigration data from DHS, and was a frustrated consumer of immigration data, frustrated, data analyst. And I took the job because I know that DHS owns all of these great data, and I wanted to be able to use it, and B, be able to help other people use it. So I really talked a lot about the same stuff that went into the plan was the reason that I took the job, and I remain very optimistic that we are still at the beginning of this process of getting all of this data aggregated and linking it up in a way that we can have just much more sophisticated analysis of what's going on, and then finding new ways to make data available to analysts on the outside. So one thing we talk about in the plan is that we will post microdata on our website. So in the same way you can go to the ACS and use American Fact Finder and ask about very specific kinds of tables for crosstabs of populations you're interested in, we think you should be able to do the same thing. How many H-1Bs were admitted from Mexico in 1985, and what states did they go to? We can answer that question, and you should be able to go and pull a few menus and go to a few drop-down menus and get that information as well.
Yeah, it's a big undertaking. Well, so let me tease you a little bit about this word non-immigrant. So before I was a
I didn't make up that word.
Expert, I came across this term non-immigrant. That's got to be the worst word in the English language. So what does it mean when you say somebody's a non-immigrant? And there are a lot of them, right? We're talking, I think this is right, 180 some million non-immigrants came to the United States last year. What?
Well, there were 181 million admissions. That wasn't 181 million different people. Okay. So immigrants in immigration law and in our yearbook are green card holders. Those are people who are permanently admitted to the U.S., who after 5 years can apply to become citizens. Mm-hmm. Non-immigrants are lawful temporary immigrants. They are not immigrants, but they're here lawfully. So most of that 181 million are tourists and business visitors, but mostly tourists. Mm-hmm. About 80% or a little more are tourists.
Really? Okay.
And that counts how many times a non-immigrant was admitted. So somebody who drives back and forth from Mexico, 50 times in a year is 50 of those.
Yeah.
And then.
Do you know that? Do you know what portion are repeats?
So
or original individuals, I guess.
Not as well as we would like to. Okay. And that 181 million. I mean, no, we don't know. Is a more direct answer. We could come up with some estimates, but what the yearbook has that number, the 181 million, and our non-immigrant flow report back there has that number. That is based on how many times the Office of Field Operations, the CBP, admitted somebody.
Yeah.
We don't know a whole lot about that population because most of those admissions are Mexicans and Canadians who don't have to give a lot of information when they enter with one of their sort of frequent travel cards.
Okay.
We know a lot more about the so-called I-94 non-immigrants, which are everybody else.
Yeah.
So that's anybody who comes from a country other than Mexico or Canada, or any Mexicans or Canadians who come other than on a B1, B2. I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's essentially what we're talking about.
You're throwing a lot of jargon at me too here.
So it's anybody who comes from a country other than Mexico and Canada, and Mexicans and Canadians who don't just come as tourists.
Yeah.
And just by driving.
So can we come up with a new word instead of non-immigrant?
Visitors.
I like visitors.
It's in the statute.
I want to.
Right. You have to talk to your friends in Congress about that.
If you're testifying, I'm going to challenge you. If a senator or congressman says we have an immigration problem, you say, no, Senator, we have a non-immigration problem. But seriously, when there's a security issue, and you have 181 million people coming in and out, as long as that system's safe, that would seem to me to be where the vulnerability is going to be. Right? It's so much transit of human bodies. Every year, which I think is a good thing. We're an open country. But.
It's certainly the case that all of the 9/11 hijackers entered lawfully as non-immigrants. None of them were unauthorized immigrants. Some of them overstayed their visa. Some of them became unauthorized after entering lawfully, but all of them came in on non-immigrant visas lawfully. And yes, there's a much larger non-immigrant flow than there is unauthorized flow. It's also the case that about between a third and half of unauthorized immigrants enter lawfully and then overstay their visas. So the unauthorized immigration problem is only partly a border problem. It's about half a non-immigrant problem. Right. I think most national security experts who look at this would agree that the border is not the primary vulnerability when it comes to terrorism, because even though there's still, tens of thousands of people who have successfully crossed the border every year, we catch over half of the people trying to cross the border. So it's just illegally. Yeah. So it is a risky way for a terrorist to try to enter versus coming across the Canadian border or coming, through on an airplane. Yeah. I mean, the smart terrorists are not walking through the desert. Yeah. That's a high risk way to get here. Yeah.
And so there's some reason that I'm poking at this, but I remember hearing about I-94s. I didn't know what everyone was talking. I grew up in Michigan. I-94 is the highway that goes from Detroit to Chicago. Our home was just off exit 110. So
I can tell you about the 110.
Yeah. So then, I wonder about, if I-94s are an issue, what about I-93s or I-91s? The alphabet soup of visas. Yeah. And acronyms and numbers. I know it might be legislatively based. I wonder if that adds to some of the confusion and concern in a democracy when we've made government so arcane that it's hard for a voter to understand and feel like the problem may sound bigger and scarier than it actually is.
It is certainly the case that immigration law is arcane. Mm-hmm. Immigration law is right up there with the tax code for being very complex, and like the tax code, part of that is because every time we go to reform immigration law, it's much easier to add than it is to rewrite. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of sections. There's a lot of, sections that have letters after their names because we've inserted a new section at the end of a section. Yeah. And it is, if there is nobody who would sit down from scratch and write an immigration code write an Immigration Nationality Act that would look remotely like the current one, just because you could do it with many fewer words and in a much more logical order if you started over. But that's not how Congress works. It's not how Congress works on easy issues, and it's definitely not how it works on hard issues.
Yeah. So let me see. I wanted to ask you some more questions about this. 181,300,000 non-immigrants in the last year.
So I'll say something else about that. Well, you can ask your question.
It's on the rise, though, isn't it? Maybe 160 million.
It's on the
10
rise.
Years ago?
It's a little bit on the rise. The number is still way down from what it was pre-9/11.
Oh, really?
We have not recovered our non-immigrant flows to where they were. I think we were close to 300 million back in the 90s. Yeah. If I remember correctly. I just had a couple other observations about the non-immigrants because I was a little surprised. I was just looking over our flow report to get ready for today. I was surprised by how large a share of the non-immigrant flow is tourists and temporary business travelers. So the number of foreign workers, it's like, so again, there's the I-94s, which are the people who we've got a lot of data on, and then there's the whole pool. When you look at the whole pool, I think I made a note about this. So about 96% of total non-immigrant admissions are tourists and business travelers. So 4% are students, workers, visiting, visiting entertainers, whatever. And then of that, workers are about half of that non-tourist flow. So it's a tiny share of all of those non-immigrants.
Sure. Yeah, on that number, it looked like to me work visas, if I can just lump all of them, H1s, H2s, and other categories, that number's grown by about 50% over the last 5 years. And so I think that's good news, right? I think it's legal status is what we might call the solution to the illegal immigrant problem, and that would be a compromise between, do you give everyone a pathway to citizenship, or you deport them all? No, you'd create some sort of a legal status, a work visa. Has that been sort of happening behind the scenes anyway?
So I think a lot of the growth that you're talking about is an accounting change, I'm sorry to say. And it's because we used to, I keep on talking about the distinction between the I-94s and the non-I-94s.
And we should say, what is an I-94?
So the I-94 is a form that non-immigrants fill out when they come to the U.S. So if you're a tourist or a student or a world-class entertainer, or a worker,
right,
when you come to the U.S., you fill out either electronically or on paper a form that says what your visa is, why you're coming, where you're from, and that's the form that we use to collect all the data that goes into this book.
Okay.
We don't know anything about, a Mexican with the border crossing card, which is a Mexican tourist visa that allows you to enter as many times as you want for 10 years, back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know anything about that. We know how many people got those cards, but they just show that card and they come in, and we don't capture any information on them.
Okay.
So we only capture information on people who fill out I-94 forms. And it used to be that Canadians who are exempted from filling out I-94 forms in 2010 or 2012, I can't remember exactly, we began collecting that electronically when they swipe, so we get about 500,000 of those a year that we didn't used to count, we now count.
Okay.
So that's a big share of that growth is Canadians on NAFTA visas.
Okay. Interesting. I'm going to ask
So
maybe
the number's been pretty flat.
Just to get the audience engaged here as well. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to you all. And if there's something on one of these topics, why don't I do this? I'll keep asking some questions, but if you want to add in or follow up or interrupt, go ahead and throw your hand up, and I'll try to do that. I wanted to shift though to refugees. The U.S. welcomed 118,431 refugees in 2015, according to Table 6. Maybe we could get this one area of confusion out of the way, because there's a Table 13, I think it is, that showed a number that was about half that big. Now, maybe this has to do with how you count Cuban refugees, asylees. Anyway, the number's gone up, 30,000 higher than the year before. Why has there been a rise? And I can ask that, stepping back, are there more refugees in the world? Is this a U.S. only phenomena? Is it all Syria? What do you think are some of the reasons that are happening with refugees and the spiking numbers?
So Table 13 is how many refugees the U.S. admits. Table 6 is how many people get green cards as a result of their refugee status. Okay. So when a Cuban enters the U.S., under wet foot, dry foot, back when we had that 2 weeks ago, they are paroled into the U.S. They're not admitted as a refugee, but then when they become a permanent resident under the Cuban Adjustment Act, they become a refugee. Okay. So we admit fewer refugees than we give green cards to.
That's interesting.
And
that's all the Cuban population?
That's almost all the Cuban population. Okay. Yeah, I think that there may be some Indo-Chinese who fall into that. I think it's all the Cubans.
So that raises a question for me, at least. With the change in that policy, is there more room then to allow more refugees from other countries?
So there's as much room to allow refugees from other countries as we want to admit. There are about, if I remember correctly, I think there are 40 million refugees in the world right now, according to the UNHCR, which is the highest that number's been since World War II. And a lot of them are refugees from Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq, but also Congo and Burma and Somalia. There's refugees all over Asia and Africa right now. The U.S. Takes in about 70,000 a year, which makes us we take in and so refugees are people who are displaced from their country of origin, their country of citizenship, and who have a fear of persecution on the basis of falling within one of 5 protected groups. It's persecution on the basis of their religion, their race, their political beliefs, being in a special protected class, or nationality, thank you. Particular social group and nationality. So you have to be displaced and you have to be targeted for one of those reasons. And then a refugee is somebody who falls into that category, who the United States reaches out to and says, you can come here, and usually based on a referral from the United Nations. The United Nations has a refugee camp, and they're saying, we have some refugees here that need a place to go. We'd like you to take them.
The difference between a refugee and an asylee?
And an asylee is somebody who has the same problem, but they are in the United States and they request asylum on the basis of being, on the basis of that fear of persecution.
So this skeptical part of me wants to wonder if this is true. 40 million, you said, refugees
I think that's right. It's. But somebody in the room probably knows.
Difference is that's refugees. They don't necessarily meet the statutory definition.
Sure.
May not meet our statutory definition. That's UN refugees.
Yeah.
That's right.
People can be displaced for any reason.
That's right.
I'm thinking conceptually, this notion that paints a picture of the world becoming worse and more dangerous and more worse. But we know there's a lot of data that says there are fewer wars, fewer fatalities from wars. The Pinker research in general. Is it transportation driven? Is it just easier to get from a country where you don't like being or you feel a little oppressed to go to another country and say, well, I'm not saying it's invalid, it's just easier to claim what's been valid, more easier now than it was a half century ago? That's not really a data question, but
yeah,
it's too interesting to let it pass.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that certainly the character of conflict has changed. There are fewer wars, but more civilian, collateral damage in the wars that we have, I think, than there used to be. Although I know Pinker maybe pushes back on that also.
I think he would.
We're getting a little out of my area of expertise.
Okay, I'll pull it back. I'll steer us back. The source countries for refugees, highly varied. 11,000 from Burma, this is in 2015, 10,000 from China, 48,000 from Cuba, just over 1,000 from Syria, so not a lot from Syria. This is 2015. I know things changed a lot in 2016, right? Haiti had just over 1,000, El Salvador about 1,000 also, Venezuela 800, Nicaragua something like 130. I would think there'd be a lot more. Actually, when I read the report, I expected to see much higher numbers from these countries where I've heard there's so much violence in Central American countries. Venezuela, for goodness sakes, I thought I'd see a lot more. Compared to Burma and China. So there's a question in my mind, and I'm thinking about this as a kid from Ohio, or a voter from Ohio. It's like, why? The U.S., I think, should be open to refugees, but to the whole world? Like maybe we could focus on our hemisphere and let Iran and Saudi Arabia and these other big, relatively stable countries help the refugees from their part of the world, or Turkey.
We take some refugees from Iran.
So why are the numbers so stilted, though, that we have so few refugees coming from war-torn areas here in our hemisphere and so many from far away?
So the short answer to that is that in setting the refugee caps, the president, in consultation with Congress, sets regional caps, and the regional cap for the Americas has been 4,000 or 5,000 for each of the last several years, and for Asia it's 30,000 or so, and Africa is 20,000. I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but that's approximately right.
Yeah.
It's in that flow report back there. So we make it is a decision that's driven by the State Department, in consultation with the United Nations, and the UN refugee populations are much larger in those parts of the world. There's not a lot of UN refugees in the Western Hemisphere. So that active resettlement mostly focuses on people displaced from those sort of major conflicts in that part of the world.
And in all fairness, 48,000 from Cuba, that is our hemisphere.
Well, right, except the Cubans, none of those are refugees in a UN sense of the word. Those are refugees in a Cuban Adjustment Act sense of the word.
But 11,000 from Burma is sort of twice the number from this cap that you mentioned being in America. That's sort of a surprising contrast.
So if you look at, so one of the other, you asked me about trends. The other really noteworthy trend in the last few years is that we are seeing a huge increase in applications for asylum. So the people fleeing the violence in Central America and Venezuela and elsewhere in our hemisphere don't get to the U.S. as refugees. by and large, but many of them come here and ask for asylum.
So this is the notion that no matter how strong your wall is, if policy is that someone can come to the wall and declare they're an asylee, then they have, we would make the effort to try to protect them. That's right?
We would consider their asylum claim and decide whether it was meritorious or not.
Yeah. Okay.
So about 20 to 30 to 35,000 people are granted asylum, which is a relatively small share of the 20% or so of the people who ask for it.
I'm going to ask one more question on this, and then, sir, I'll go to yours. Okay. Mine is, do refugees and asylees, what percentage of them eventually adjust to LPR status? Is that automatic once you're granted a refugee or asylee status that you can have at your discretion, or you have to maybe declare?
Refugees are required by law to adjust to LPR status after a year. Asylees are eligible to adjust after 5 years.
Okay. Why is that?
Which half?
Oh, why is that someone would be required? Like, do other countries automatically sort of default that someone's brought in as a refugee while their country's at war, and instead of waiting for 3 years or 5 years, or maybe it's 12 years for the war to end and then adjust them back home, say, no, you have to automatically become a citizen here in Germany, Turkey?
Historically, the U.S. has really emphasized resettlement and assimilation. We historically have encouraged immigrants to become citizens and encouraged refugees to become immigrants and then citizens.
Yeah. So it is unique compared to other countries, and I know you're expert on so much here on U.S. law that is impressive.
The U.S. is more oriented that way than most other countries. It's not totally unique. Generally speaking, the English-speaking settler states, U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, have had that type of set of policies, although Australia and New Zealand have walked it back a little bit recently. And I would say that it largely comes from their history as settler states. The U.S. wrote its constitution. It was written by a bunch of immigrants. Or second generation or third generation immigrants. So, and there were a lot of immigrants coming to the country at the time. And so, and then when we wrote our immigration laws, the first federal immigration laws, the first federal immigration restrictions were written at a time when we were trying to roll it back. But the laws that were written right after the Constitution was passed was all about, making people into citizens.
Right. All right. Sir, you had a question.
Yeah, what's the difference between being granted asylum affirmatively or defensively?
So an affirmative asylum claim is somebody who is in the country lawfully as a non-immigrant, like they're here as a tourist or a student, and they go in and request asylum. I'm here legally, but I don't want to go home. I'm scared to go home. A defensive claim is somebody who is apprehended by the Border Patrol or otherwise here unlawfully and requests asylum.
The basic difference is that the defensive claim is decided by immigration judges. The affirmative claims are addressed and granted, can only be granted by officers, asylum officers in the Department of Homeland Security. And they can only grant, they don't grant, well, in some cases they can deny, but in most cases they can only grant. And then if the person is here illegally, if they've applied affirmatively, then their case will be referred to an immigration judge, and the person gets a whole nother asylum hearing before the immigration judge.
Right.
Kind of a 2 bites of the apple approach.
Yes, sir.
Point of fact and a question. Dave Rafferty from CBO. Hey, Mark.
Thank you. Yeah.
In fiscal year 15, the president set the refugee admissions cap at 85,000, and I think the number of admissions was like 84,990, so the cap was basically met. And then for fiscal 16, the President Obama set it at 110,000. Whether or not that will change is up to the president. Shifting away from humanitarian issues for a moment, the non-immigrant population estimates is an outstanding product. What sorts of things are on your agenda to try to enhance that? I'm thinking particularly of what is the H-1B and L-1 population in the United States?
So that's an enhancement. So let me just let me just give a very general comment in response to that, which is we are totally interested and eager to hear what enhancements you would like to see. I mean, that's part of my mission. The reason I was eager to accept the invitation is, send me an email, go to our website and send it to our mailbox or whatever. But we would like to know that, because now that we have caught up essentially so that we're no longer 2 years in the hole on our publishing, we're in a position to rethink some of these reports and to try to make some improvements. On the non-immigrant population estimate, we have an ongoing conversation, Brian Baker, the author of that report, and I, about what's possible. What does he feel comfortable with statistically estimating? And he is a extremely careful and good researcher, and keeps me honest. And so we will only put those numbers out there if Brian becomes convinced that we can do so in a responsible way. And he's not here today. I can put y'all in touch.
Get back to the enforcement thing for a moment. I think you touched on this earlier, but I just wanted to clarify. Is it basically the case that in the past few years, that unless you were caught at the border, either shortly after sneaking in, or you presented at a port of entry and were refused admission, or you're a criminal, your order of removal is really not enforced? I mean, if you're here in the interior of the United States, you don't fall into the first category, and if you don't fall into the second category, you might go through the whole process of hearing for an immigration judge, but that order's not enforced. Is that, except in a minuscule number of cases?
Short answer
I'm
is,
reading Appendix 2, Table 1
on that report. Yeah, so that report is an effort to answer your question. And the short answer is mostly what you said is accurate. The department in 2010 and 2011 published new enforcement priorities that applied to ICE, that were published by then ICE Director John Morton. And then in 2014, Secretary Johnson published some additional priorities that applied to the whole department. And those priorities emphasized recent border crossers, serious criminals, and with varying degrees of seriousness and varying levels of priority, and people who have been ordered removed after January 2014, and people who have otherwise seriously abused the visa system. And what our report that we published last month shows is that something like 98 or 99% of all apprehensions, arrests, and inadmissibility determinations fell into one of those categories, and about 98 or 99% of all removals and returns fell into one of those categories. So it's people apprehended at the border, or people who have been convicted of a crime, or people who have recently been ordered removed.
And within that, it's really the lion's share is people caught at the border.
Very
much the lion's share.
That's right. And the report, if you read the key findings in the report, the last bullet in those key findings will tell you exactly how many fall into that border category. And the reason that they'll, with that set of priorities, the main reason that so many of them, look, if we say we're going to deport anybody who's a serious criminal and anybody who we catch at the border, we catch a lot more people at the border than we catch serious criminals. Mostly because we've got a lot of infrastructure at the border to catch people, but also because there are not a lot of immigrants who are serious criminals. They are a small share of the unauthorized population. I mean, we've looked at this at DHS. I did a report on this when I was at MPI. There's just not a lot of immigrants who commit serious crimes. They commit crimes at lower rates than native-born, and they commit serious crimes at lower rates than native-born. So I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but of the 11 million or so unauthorized immigrants, there's I don't have the numbers in my head. I don't want to make up a number, but it's a small percentage. It's like, I think my MPI estimate, this is work I did before I got to DHS, I think I estimated something like 3% of the unauthorized population had committed serious crimes, and another 3% had committed misdemeanors. Mm-hmm. So there's just not a lot of them out there.
Yeah, these numbers, I mean, I tried to prepare and write some good questions, but you really can get a lot. But some of it's just shocking. So alien apprehensions, and I may be repeating things that you said, but I look a year ago, these were 1.6 million, 1.7 million, 1.8 million.
Not
per
a year ago. Those were a decade ago.
A decade ago, per year, you're getting that number. Now it went through the last few years, 800,000, 678, 662. 2015 was 462. So apprehensions are coming way down.
And that number is the sum of border apprehensions plus
Internal.
interior arrests.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean they're all deported, right?
That's right. Yeah, so, and one other comment I want to make in response to your question, it's not, I mean, the vast majority of cases of DHS not deporting non-priorities is not that they're getting ordered removed and DHS is not complying with the order. It's that DHS is not initiating removal proceedings against people who fall outside the priorities. So they, you know, if somebody is not a serious criminal or apprehended at the border, we don't take them into custody. In the last couple of years, generally, we don't take them into custody. We don't put them before an immigration judge. We just exercise the discretion to not interact with them. So once somebody gets an order of removal from the judge, DHS tries to remove that person, although there are plenty of people who get an order and don't get removed.
Digging into that number in the by country, Mexico, it seems to make up apprehensions by individuals from Mexico makes up roughly 2/3, 3/4, and that number's come down dramatically from 1 million 7 years ago to 250,000 in 2015. I mean, you know, we're looking 100,000 or 80,000 drop. Are there other interesting trends for other countries? Because you'd think Canada, Mexico, bordering countries, you'll have more of these issues. What are some? Who are the top 10 countries where you find a lot of apprehensions? And is the number, or I'm sorry, the countries in that top 10, have those changed?
So the top 4 are Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras.
Okay.
Those have been the top 4 for a long time. They are in a class by themselves. I mean, it's those 4 together represent, I don't know, do you know the exact number, Chris? Like they're 90%
On the
or
spot.
more? Probably 95%?
95. Wow.
I guess those 4 countries account for, I would guess, at least 95% of all apprehensions and arrests. And within those 4, it used to be that Mexico was 70 or 80 or 90, and the other 3 were 5 or 10. Now it's Mexico is half or I mean, less than half at the border. So that's a huge change, that we have many fewer Mexicans unlawfully entering the U.S. We have a lot more Central Americans, but a large share of those Central Americans are women and children who present themselves and seek asylum. They're not trying to sneak into the country. They are walking into the country and finding the first Border Patrol agent they can find and saying, hey, I want asylum.
So
or some other form of relief. It's not always asylum in their cases.
Do the demographics of apprehensions then differ from the asylees in a significant way? So you're talking about more criminal activity in the apprehension population?
So the apprehension population includes people apprehended at the border who are trying to sneak into the country, people apprehended at the border who are entering the country to try to seek relief, and then people arrested in the interior, almost all of whom are arrested through the PEP program, which used to be called the Secure Communities Program, which is an information sharing program between DHS and DOJ that allows, when somebody gets arrested by a local law enforcement agency, their fingerprints come to DHS, so DHS can try to take custody of them.
How old's that program?
That information sharing technology was put in place by the Bush administration in 2008 on in a handful of jurisdictions, and it has, since 2013, it has been in every law enforcement jurisdiction in the country. Okay. So it's become nationwide for years.
Let me come back after the top 4.
So after the top 4, it's
shifting?
Dominican Republic, Haiti. I'm looking at my enforcement expert over here. Help me out. Yeah, Nicaragua, Colombia. It's mostly Western Hemisphere.
Similar regional. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So let me open it up, broad spectrum, questions on any topic. I think Marc wanted to hear more, and I hogged the stage a little bit, but I could ask more myself. Sir, I don't think you've spoken yet. Can you, again, feel free to introduce yourself.
My name's Lauren Thompson. How comfortable are you with the 11 million illegal number? Some argue that's decades old, does not take into account population growth while they're here, or the vast number that are have been coming in recent months. Second question, do you have any practical recommendations for how we might get a handle on the illegal overstays for visas?
So on the first question, there are 3 different organizations that estimate the unauthorized population: the Pew Research Center, the Center for Migration Studies, and DHS. We all 3 use broadly similar methodologies, but we make slightly different assumptions. We all 3 come up with very similar numbers. It's around 11 million, sort of plus or minus a million. That number, if you look historically, that number, that estimate, between 1980 and 2007, that number grew by about 500,000 a year. We went from basically 0 to 12 million over that 20-year period, and all of the models found that. Since 2007, the number has been flat or trending slightly down, according to everybody's analysis. And the reason is that we deport a lot more people, and a lot fewer people are coming. So it used to be that we didn't deport as many people, and a lot more people were coming, and so the population kept growing. And the population is not growing anymore. It is definitely flat or shrinking, probably shrinking slightly, maybe flat. That is accounting for the recent inflows. It's just that even with the surge of Central Americans, we are still deporting more people than are coming because we have ramped up our enforcement capacity over the last 3 decades, but especially over the last decade. There's just no way to look at the numbers and not reach that conclusion. The one other comment I would have on the first part of your question is that the unauthorized population can't grow once it gets here because, if you're talking about children of unauthorized, those are citizens. So the only way the unauthorized population can grow is if more unauthorized immigrants come. And the number coming has gotten much smaller, and the number leaving has gotten bigger. So that number is staying the same or getting smaller over the last decade or so. In terms of the overstays, so the department, has last year put out for the first time an estimate of visa overstayers, just looking at those B1, B2, the tourists and business travelers, which represent the vast majority of non-immigrants. This year, we are preparing to release an update to that report, which will look at essentially all non-immigrant visa categories. And basically, the way that analysis works is that we collect information about every non-immigrant who comes in, with the exception of a lot of the border crossers, but about every non-immigrant who comes in on an airplane or on a boat. And we collect, not directly, but through information sharing with airlines and other carriers, information about everybody who's leaving. And so we look and see people who are supposed to leave, have they shown up in the departure data or not? And that's how we can find overstays. It is not a perfect methodology, but it's a pretty good methodology. We have a pretty good idea of which people have overstayed in any given period. What we don't currently do essentially at all is, I shouldn't say essentially at all. What we don't do as much of is once we see, hey, this person was supposed to leave last week and we have no record that they left, we don't know where they are.
That's my question.
Yeah.
How do we get at that problem?
So what ICE currently does is they look at that list of everybody who was supposed to leave and didn't, and they bounce it against, what we know about people who have committed crimes or people who are on terror watch lists. And if there's somebody who we think overstayed a visa and we think committed a murder, we do police work to try to find them. ICE has investigation teams that will go out and try to find those high priority cases, but we have not decided that. One reason that we place a higher priority on apprehending people at the border than chasing down all those visa overstayers is that at least with the visa overstayers, we know that at one point the State Department and DHS decided that person was okay to come in. So as a starting assumption, they're not terrorists or known criminals, or we wouldn't have given them a visa in the first place. Yeah. So given that person was okay to come in, we haven't committed the resources to going and chasing them all down. What we have done instead is we've gone after the people who are a priority for some reason, and then mostly the way we have found people inside the U.S. is waiting for them to get arrested for some random reason, and then if they're deportable, we get them then.
So Mark, I'm sorry to clarify, someone comes in on a visa, then they sort of disappear just because you're not tracking them daily. We don't live in that world. Can they have left and you wouldn't know?
So if they've left on an airplane or a boat, we should know, but we won't always know because it's not a perfect data collection
The entry-exit
system.
system's not perfect.
Right. And if they've left in a car, if they've driven to Canada, we wouldn't. Well, if they've driven to Canada, we would know now if they're a third country national because we've got information sharing with Canada. If they drove to Mexico, we don't know anything about people who drive to Mexico.
Yeah. I had some friends, and again, I had some friends who years ago were telling me they see all these immigrants coming over the border in San Diego County. I think this is pre-wall, and never seen any going in the other direction. I thought, well, they don't have to sneak back. They can just go out and it's not recorded.
Right.
But is there a penalty now in law if you were caught not committing a crime, just you go to fly from, Columbus, Ohio to Chicago and don't go on I-94. If you fly and they say, oh, wait, you've overstayed. And they're like, oops. Some nice person from the Netherlands has just been here longer than they were supposed to. What's the penalty for that individual?
So we would not typically detect that individual by virtue of them taking a domestic flight because we don't, we wouldn't necessarily find that person. The penalty for overstaying the visa is that you are deportable. It's not illegal to overstay a visa. It's illegal to enter without permission. It is not illegal to overstay a visa.
And there's no overhang, though. It's not like they're penalized when they reapply?
They, yes, if they get deported, they will, if they overstay the visa and they get identified and put in removal proceedings, they would become ineligible to get a visa in the future.
Okay.
For some period of time.
Can you compare, in terms of keeping track of people who overstay visa, can you compare that with other countries? Are we singularly worse? And the related question is, you said, yes, someone who had a visa, there'd been some checking before they got the visa. What about the population of the visa waiver countries?
So to answer your second question, the visa waiver country people go through pretty extensive vetting also. The biggest difference is that they don't have to go sit for an interview with the State Department employee, with a visa official. They fill out a form online with the same kind of information. So it's less vetting, but it's not like we know nothing about those people. We check, and they give their fingerprints. We check their name and fingerprints against, the databases. So there is some vetting for the visa waiver countries. It's pretty extensive. Also, it's just an easier process than what the non-visa waiver countries go through, and also for a longer, they get a longer authorized travel. And then to your first question, I don't know what kind of breakdown there is between illegal entries and overstayers in other countries. I think for most of Europe, most of the unauthorized population are overstayers. They're mostly people who, a lot of them are people who are asylum seekers who get their asylum. So they would have, the European case is pretty different because people may cross the Mediterranean, ask for asylum in Greece, and while they're waiting for that claim to get adjudicated, travel throughout the Schengen region to some other country. So they've entered lawfully because there's no border checks, but they didn't enter Europe lawfully. I don't really have an informed answer to what share of them are overstayers versus illegal entries. It certainly has. The share of illegal entries has increased recently. We've had a lot more, sort of humanitarian flow across the Mediterranean and overland, through Turkey than we used to. The U.S. has a much larger unauthorized population than any of those other countries, both absolutely and per capita. The last number, I think the number I saw, I think that Europe has something like 3 million unauthorized immigrants altogether. Versus 11 or so here. All of Europe is 500 million, we're 300 million, but it's still, 30 330 million or whatever. So we have a bigger unauthorized population.
Ken Meyercord. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, and yet very few Nicaraguans try and get here compared to Guatemala or Honduras. Is that the result of some policy of ours, or is the Honduran border more secure than our own?
So there's at least a few factors that contribute to that. One is that Nicaragua is farther south than any of those other countries, and it shares a border with Costa Rica. So most Nicaraguans who are immigrating for work go to Costa Rica, which is right next door, rather than going through the rest of Central America and through Mexico to get here. Whereas other Central Americans, even though Costa Rica's closer, for a variety of reasons, they have a history of coming here. So there are unauthorized Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, not in the U.S. A second reason is that Nicaragua is poor, but it is much safer. There's much less crime in Nicaragua than there is in any of the rest of Central America. And, one explanation I've heard for that is that the Sandinistas, Daniel Ortega is somewhat authoritarian, but there's no crime there. So that's a factor. There's less of that kind of immigration leaving Nicaragua. And then a third thing is that the U.S., back during the Cold War, the U.S. admitted a lot of wealthy Nicaraguans, who were affiliated with the Somoza regime, so there's a relatively large lawful Nicaraguan population, but it does not have connections to to sort of working class Nicaraguans. It has connections to the wealthy Nicaraguans. So, the populations from the rest of Central America that are here were more like, your sort of stereotypical Latin American immigrant, with poor background and may have fled from, so they're connected to still poor Central Americans, and there's just not that. The Nicaraguan population here doesn't look like the other Central American populations. It doesn't attract, the flow of poor Nicaraguans is to Costa Rica, not to the U.S.
Right. So we know that this area of law and policy is increasingly politicized, and it's only going to get uglier in the months to come. I wonder if you would comment on the role that facts, like this diligent collection of facts in this book, actually will play in the policy debate. I mean, is stuff like this kind of old-fashioned in the current policy climate we've got, where people are constructing their alternative realities?
It's a good question. So I worked on the Hill back in the pre-alternative fact days, and back then, I felt like that facts play an important role in the debate, but each side wants to use the facts that they want to use for the reasons they want to use them. I certainly think
It's very lawyerly in that respect.
yeah,
True. Yeah.
but I think that I think that facts contribute to both the kinds of arguments both sides can make and to the kind of narrative that an informed population consumes. And I agree with you that there are certainly prominent politicians who are less concerned about using facts in their arguments, and that, not just recently, but trending for several years, the media has also become so polarized, and, people listen to their own news sources and so on. So I think the role that facts play in the conversation is evolving in probably a direction that I don't like.
And let me put just a little context on that. And something we haven't talked too much about here is the wall. I've always been surprised how the extremes in this debate both want to pretend that a wall doesn't exist at all, right? That it would be horrible if one was built, and it would be wonderful if one was built, but based on the assumption that there's nothing that's been done, and yet over a nearly 2,000-mile border, there's 650 miles already constructed of wall that's been, in my recollection, it did change things in San Diego County when the wall was put up there. And so it's there. And I don't know if it has all the positive or all the negative connotations. I'm not sure that completing it's going to have, all the euphoria that one side wants to think or all the devastating impact the other side wants.
So I think that most CBP analysts, most CBP leaders believe that we need the wall that we have, that it has been a critical addition to our border defenses. And the places that we have walls and fences and barriers now are in, mostly in sort of the urban and suburban areas that are close to transportation infrastructure and where we have large numbers of agents and lots of surveillance equipment. So what the wall or the fence does is it slows an unauthorized immigrant down by 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, during which time an agent can get to them before they can get to a car on the freeway and disappear. A wall in the middle of the desert that slows the person down by 3 or 4 or 5 minutes before they spend 4 days walking to a freeway, when the agents are 200 miles away, is not going to change the facts on the ground at all.
Yeah.
And I think that you will find very few people in Border Patrol who would disagree with what I just said.
It's amazing, 650 miles out of a 1,950 mile border. That's almost exactly a third. It'd be hard to get more precise than that. But if you look at, just say, California, Arizona, New Mexico, the percentage is a lot higher.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the barrier that exists is in the western half of that border.
And that's so it's partly because of what I just described. It's partly because most of Arizona and California land near the border is federal land. Almost all of Texas is private land.
I see.
And so
it's on the river.
And it's river land instead of desert land. So for both of those reasons, but mostly the private land reason, it's harder to put wall there. But also, most of Texas is more remote than Arizona's got some remote parts and most of the fencing in Arizona is vehicle barriers. It's not fence. It's like they look like Normandy, like
Guardrails.
yeah,
basically,
that prevent because it's too far for somebody to walk to infrastructure before they get apprehended, but it's not too far to drive to infrastructure. So you just want to keep the cars out.
Yeah. But that's a point where I think there's a fact that you don't often hear in the conversation, and the more you can hammer that there is wall like that. What you've just said, I don't think I hear often in public discourse, so it can be refreshing.
So this is I'm not the first person who's you can certainly find congressional testimony to this effect. And then the one other point I would make about the wall conversation, which we touched on before, a wall is not going to have an impact on people who are coming and presenting themselves and seeking asylum because they're going to come to a gate.
Yeah. All right, we're at 3 minutes left. If anybody wants to ask maybe one more question or two, yeah, please go ahead.
I'm curious about explanatory note D, data withheld to limit dissemination. I guess that means we won't tell you. Why?
So those are cells in the table that are small enough that you could find out sort of personal identifying information about somebody. So it's just it's too small for us to report on it.
We just got into the weeds. Little footnotes. What a great comprehensive review of
Thank you.
immigration. Please join me in thanking Marc Rosenblum.